With this, welcome to a new series here on Synths and Sounds, where I use vintage gear in an unconventional way. Today we start off this series with the Casio FZ-1 sampler, without using any samples. But before we dive into the video, let's watch the way too long intro that I spent way too much time on.
In the music production world, a lot of gear is used. In Switzerland, one small music YouTuber tries to find ways of using that gear in a creative and unconventional manner. These are his stories.
Well, calling the Casio FZ-1 a sampler doesn't live up to its functions. While the FZ-1 was set out to compete with Akai's S-series samplers, Casio went one step further. Samplers share the most of functions with synthesizers, having an amplifier and filter that is adjustable via envelopes and LFOs. It's just a sampling engine instead of an oscillator that provides the sound fundamentals. But a sampling engine can do more than sampling. If your sample is just a sawtooth or square shape, it can be used as a digital oscillator. Today, digital oscillators are quite common, as the Arturia Microfreak, the Novation Peak and the Korg Minilogue XD make use of it as a sound engine in combination with an analog filter. The FZ-1 follows a similar concept. So let's first dive into the sound engine and see what we can get out of it. After that, I'm gonna show you how you can use the FZ-1's versatile 8-voice polyphonic architecture to get into ambienty realms as well as into Jupiter-8 levels of fatness. Yeah, you heard that right. So as you can see, the FZ-1 has a nice backlit display, which is a huge advantage in comparison to the earlier CZ synthesizers. And first we want to see how the sound engine works and what you can get out of it without using samples. So let's just dive straight into that. So right now there is no sound on the keyboard. So first we have to select our source. And we can already see that there are quite some options. Most of them have to do with sampling, since it's a very advanced sampler. You can record samples directly with the FZ-1. You can do many operations, truncating, all those things that you would expect from a professional sampler. But you can also select wave synth. So that's what we are going to do today. Now you can see we still get quite a lot of options. The first two are irrelevant, and then we get 4 different options to use the sampling engine as a synthesis engine. So first and most logical, we can use a preset wave. For example, a simple sawtooth, a square, a pulse, and a double sine. But if you don't like any of these waves, you can also go and draw a wave by hand. For this, you go to hand drawing and you press the display button, and already you see the last wave you have selected. Now you can adjust the wave by hand. You have 69 steps for your wave, and you can set them all manually, which goes something like that. And now we have a hand-drawn wave to use as a sound base, which probably doesn't sound too well since I didn't intend to do any proper wave. But yeah, you can do that. So that's pretty cool. I've never seen another synthesizer where you can choose to draw your waveform by hand. So yeah, pretty exciting. Also, you get a sine synthesis mode, which is really cool since it works like old organs. For example, like the Casio 701, which I showed you recently on the channel. Many old organ-style synthesizers use additive sine synthesis, which means you add higher frequent sines to your bass sine to create harmonics. So that's really a cool function if you want to go for some old school sounds as you had them on early organs. And finally, you could go and cut a very short part of a sample just to use it as a wave shape. So it would be not even a fraction of a second of a sample to then use that repetitively as your waveform. But we are not going to do that because it would mean that we use a sample. So we stick to the hand drawing mode, the sine synthesis, and the preset waves. So you still get 3 different modes of doing things without using samples. So that's pretty impressive to me. So I go back and select a simple sawtooth wave just to present the next options. So now we have selected our sawtooth wave, we can go and edit it. Now the sound still sounds very raw, so we can go to create voice. And we get a lot of options. Looping is more important for samples, obviously. You can tune it, you can set the velocity, sensitivity, you have LFO options, but most importantly, you get your DCA and DCF envelope. So it is the typical envelope that maybe some of you know from the Casio CZ. It is an 8-step envelope where you are free to select your endpoint and sustain point at any of those 8 steps. So it's quite complicated to use, but once you get into it, it's not too much of a difference compared to an ADSR, and you can use it even more creatively. But that's something for another video. Once you have turned down the filter envelope to 0, you can then hear the cutoff via directly addressing it as a value, which sounds like this. The bubbly sound comes from the filter being controlled via small steps in a digital way, but it is in fact an analog filter which is just digitally controlled. So this makes the filter actually sounds pretty nice while being this kind of weirdly bubbly, but still I like it a lot. So let's turn up the resonance by a bit to listen to that. So let's set the filter resonance to the maximum and have a listen to that. So as you can hear right now, it sounds rather distorted, but this is due to the level being very high. So once you set the DCA to another level, you can get rid of that. So actually, in my opinion, it's very awesome having an analog filter, even though it's digitally controlled. It's a nice addition, not just to use it as a synth, but especially when using it on samples, you can do pretty cool things with it. Also, you can select quite a lot of different things to put it on your modulation wheel. So if you go into the settings for that, you can see that you can assign the different LFO values to it. So you could do the vibrato thing, which most modulation wheels do, but you can also select the filter level to it, which means that then you can play the filter cutoff via the modulation wheel, so you even get a real-time possibility to change the sound, which you didn't get on the CZ series. Alright, since the next thing is gonna be complicated, I hand it back over to scripted me. Let's talk about polyphony. The FZ-1 has 8 voice polyphony, which means that 8 different sounds can be played at once. If you use it as a synthesizer, each of the hardware voices can play one oscillator. Since the FZ-1 is also thought to be a sampler, you can freely assign any of the sounds to any part of the keyboard. For example, you could assign a different drum sample to each key of the lowest octave, while still being able to assign another sound to the upper part of the keyboard. You can have up to 64 different sounds spread over the keyboard, with the only limitation of playing a maximum of 8 of them at once. This means that you can get them onto different keys, but also you can get up to 8 of them on the same key. Let's get back to the sound of Van Halen's Jump in the beginning. The classic synth line was originally played on an Oberheim synth that had 2 slightly detuned saw oscillators per voice to make it sound fatter. You can do this easily on the FZ-1 as well, by assigning 2 slightly detuned sawtooth sounds to the same section of the keyboard. By layering 2 sounds on the same key, you can get fatter sounds, but your playable polyphony gets reduced to 4 notes at a time. Now I had the fat sound of an Oberheim, but I ran into another problem. Originally, the synth on Van Halen's Jump uses 5 voices of polyphony, since it uses 3 notes on the chords, while the bass note is played in 2 octaves at once. With this being impossible for the FZ-1, I took advantage of splitting and layering again. While in the upper part of the keyboard I used the 2 sounds in the same octave, I selected the lower part of the keyboard to play the second sound an octave lower. Doing this, I get an octave in the bass without having to press 2 keys. So now we can do a pretty decent cover of Van Halen's Jump. If you like, you can go over to reverb.com's YouTube channel and tell me who made a more accurate cover. Was it me using a budget vintage sampler, or was it some reverb professional using an expensive modern Oberheim synth? So now we know about layering, let's try to create the fattest possible sound that we can get out of it. Therefore, I programmed a very basic bass sound, which doesn't sound too special once you use just 1 oscillator. And also I've assigned the mod wheel to the filter. So now I took this bass sound and copied it 8 times. And then I took each of the 8 sounds and slightly detuned it to the others. So in the end I had 8 versions of the same sound that all sounded slightly different. So now we can stack the 8 layers to make the FZ-1 completely monophonic, but being able to play 8 oscillators in unison at the same time, which then sounds totally different. So that is a pretty fat sound already, but it's not Jupiter levels of fat, since the Jupiter, as also many Oberheim synths, had the option to pan a different sound to the left and to the right. Most often they used the same sound panned once to the left and once to the right to then have the oscillators play differently on the left and right side. The sound was still the same, but you had it doubled and you got this kind of chorus effect since it's now in stereo. So the cool thing is we can do that sound in stereo as well. So let me quickly change my setup and make sure you have stereo headphones or a good stereo speaker setup for the next part of the video. As you can see, I have now an entirety of 9 cables coming out of my FZ-1. While still having attached the mix output from before, there are now 8 different single outputs for each of the voices. This makes totally sense since it was meant to be a sampler, so you could have a different output for each of your drum sounds to then add different effects to them, for example. Well, I'm now using all 8 outputs on the same sound, but I have them plugged into 4 stereo channels on my mixer, which means that I have 4 of my voices panned to the left and 4 of my voices panned to the right. So let's have another listen to the sound from before, but now in stereo. So there you go. That's obviously completely without any effects, no added chorus or anything at all. It's just a very fat sound that even gets close to what you can get out of an Oberheim or Jupiter-8. As you can see, I now have brought my MMT8 sequencer into the game. I really didn't just use it to make a review, I really use it pretty much all the time I am at the studio. And now I've programmed a fairly basic sequence to show another really cool function that I stumbled across while trying to make the fattest sound. So here's what this little sequence I came up with sounds in mono. So as you could hear, it's not a spectacular sequence at all. What I did was I used the sine synthesis engine to do this kind of old school organ-like sound. But what if we don't listen to it via one mix output, but if we assign it to the 8 single outputs? What happens is that while each of the sounds only uses one of the voices, it will automatically change in between the different voices from time to time. So once we have set this not to one mono output, but to the 8 separate outputs, it will kind of start to pan several sounds regularly, once to the left and then to the right. What we can do in the next step is adjust the level on the mixer. So since we have it still on 8 stereo outputs, we can choose the 4 volume mixers of the stereo output inputs of the mixer to set it all to different volume levels. Now let's add a ton of reverb and have another listen to it and get already deeply into ambient realms. So that's another very creative use of using the 8 outputs and how the FZ-1 triggers all the different outputs one after another by adding a structure to it via setting a different volume level to each of the outputs, and also panning some of them left and some of them right. So really having all these outputs gives you a lot of capabilities to play around. So for the end, I've put together a piece that uses all the things that we had before. I'm having a 2-voice polyphonic stereo bass. I'm having the sine synthesis pattern from before in the middle. And up here I have a hand-drawn sine wave that is playing mono with only one voice to be another lead. Also I have attached a distortion pedal to that voice, so I can use that as another effect. Also I have only reverb on the sine synthesized part, and the rest doesn't need some, so I can use that on the different outputs as well. So I wanted to make 2 points with this video. Point 1 is that it doesn't really depend what gear you get, it more depends on how you use it. I think that's a point that has been made quite often already, but it's not important enough to emphasize on this point again and again. All the time it's about a creative use, and don't think about your gear being limited. Just try to get most out of it within the limits of the gear. That's the most interesting part of sound design to me. You don't need a computer with a huge DAW where your possibilities are limitless. Maybe you are limited to the sound engine of a sampling synthesizer of the 80s, and then you can start from that point to do it very creatively. I think what I did here with the 8 different outputs was a pretty cool point to prove that once you start thinking out of the box, you can get really interesting sounds out of something that wasn't intended to be used like that. Point 2 I wanted to make is, if you have an FZ-1, lucky you. Really, I fell in love a second time after I got it, when I started creating this video, when I started realizing how many options I have just with this. And as you saw today, I haven't even touched on the sampling part, since it's also a very decent and very high quality 16-bit sampler. So the audio quality is quite nice. As a sampler, you just get 1 megabyte of sampling space that you can save on a floppy disk, so it's not a lot of sampling time that you get. Keep that in mind if you want to get it as a sampler. So if you don't have one and want to get one, you can be quite lucky, because if you see that at my place, it means that it's not too expensive, since then I couldn't afford it. So believe it or not, I didn't even pay 250 euros for it. It was not even a year ago. Big shout out goes to Carlo. If you see this video, thanks a lot. I'm having so much fun with the sampler synthesizer that I bought from you. And if you're looking for one yourself, then you should not just look for a Casio FZ-1, but also for the FZ-10M rack mount version and for the Honor HS-1. The Honor HS-1 is just a rebranded FZ-1, so one of them you should find for not too much money. So, as always, thanks for watching, stay creative, stay inspired, and subscribe for more synths and sounds.